Arthur Miller stood in the doorway of the dim, overheated bedroom, the air thick with the heavy scent of wintergreen ointment, lingering liniment, and the sweet, fading musk of a life ending. Outside, the cold November wind howled across the vast expanse of the Kansas plains, rattling the old wooden window panes of the homestead that had stood for nearly a century. Arthur, 30 years old, had not slept in 4 nights. His eyes were deeply sunken, his beard coarse and untamed, and his calloused hands rested heavily on his knees as he watched his father breathe. Benjamin Miller was fading away with the stubborn, agonizing slowness of a man who held on to a secret he had never found the courage to speak. Every 30 minutes, a harsh, rattling cough shook the old man's frame, wrenching his thin shoulders beneath the patchwork quilt. The local country doctor, a tired man named Dr. Evans, had visited twice that week, each time shaking his head with that quiet, helpless finality common to men who heal bodies but cannot mend time. Arthur never left the room. He wiped his father's fevered brow with cool cloths, spooned warm broth between parched lips, and read aloud from the local newspaper, even though Benjamin could no longer process the words. It was simply what Arthur knew how to do: stay, endure, and care for the dying, while the rest of the world turned its back. Out on the porch, an old black dog with a frosted muzzle slept curled against the front door, just as he had for as long as anyone in Cedar County could remember. No one recalled when the dog had arrived at the ranch. He simply appeared one autumn years ago. Yet everyone assumed he had always been part of the land. Benjamin loved the animal with a fierce, quiet devotion that often seemed deeper than the affection he showed his own flesh and blood. On Tuesday afternoon, as the sun began to sink behind the distant rolling hills, a sleek black sedan crunched up the gravel driveway. The passenger door opened, and Julian Miller stepped out. Julian, 42 years old, wore a tailored charcoal suit and city shoes covered in pale country dust. His hair was slicked back with pomade, though the harsh prairie wind had already tousled the strands across his forehead. In his right hand, he carried a heavy paper bag containing an imported bottle of whiskey no one had asked for. Julian was the elder son, the one who had moved to Chicago 4 years earlier, calling only on holidays and sending messages through third parties whenever the family land seemed profitable. When the estate felt distant, he forgot the family entirely. When money was mentioned, he remembered he had a father. He strode past the bedroom door without acknowledging Arthur, stepping directly to the side of the dying man's bed. Julian stared down at his father for 3 long seconds before speaking in a booming, impatient voice. "He looks terrible. Is he really this bad?" Arthur did not look up from his chair. "He's been like this for a week. The doctor says it's only a matter of hours." Julian grunted, placing the whiskey bottle on the floor and inspecting the label as if it were the most important thing in the room. He pulled up a wooden stool on the opposite side of the bed. "Dad," Julian said loudly, as if addressing someone hard of hearing. "It's me, Julian. I drove in from the city." Benjamin's eyelids fluttered open, struggling against the heavy curtain of exhaustion. He looked at Julian, then slowly shifted his cloudy gaze toward Arthur. The moment his eyes met Arthur's, the tension in the old man's face softened, as if he had finally found solid ground after a lifetime of sinking. With an effort that seemed to drain the last dregs of his remaining life, Benjamin raised a trembling hand and gripped Arthur's wrist. The old man's lips parted, letting out a dry, broken whisper. "Faithful, take care of Faithful. Don't leave him here. He's out on the porch. Arthur, in him." A violent fit of coughing cut off the rest of the sentence, rattling his frail chest. "I'm here, Dad," Don't worry, I've got him, Arthur reassured him, squeezing his father's calloused hand. Across the bed, Julian narrowed his eyes, watching the exchange with a cold, guarded curiosity that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Benjamin Miller passed away quietly that night at 2 o'clock in the morning, his hand resting securely within Arthur's, accompanied only by the soft, rhythmic scratching of Faithful at the front door. Julian was sleeping soundly in the guest bedroom down the hall when the end finally came. The reading of the last will and testament took place 3 days later in the cramped office of Mr. Harrison Vance, the sole attorney in Cedar County. Vance's office smelled of cheap cigars and aged parchment, surrounded by dusty law books that looked untouched by human hands. Arthur arrived with his wife, Martha, and their 14-year-old son, Leo. Julian arrived 5 minutes later alone, offering no apologies for his tardiness as he unbuttoned his suit jacket and took a seat. Attorney Vance adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat twice with theatrical solemnity, and began to read aloud the legal document that would alter the course of their lives forever. When the reading concluded, an oppressive silence settled over the room. The Willow Creek Ranch, comprising hundreds of acres of fertile farmland, the grazing pastures, the livestock, the barns, the heavy machinery, and the grand two-story farmhouse, was bequeathed in its entirety to Julian Miller, the elder son. To Arthur Miller, the younger son who had given his youth and sweat to the soil, the will left exactly one thing: the old dog. Faithful. Leo squeezed the leather notebook in his hands until his knuckles turned completely white. Martha lowered her gaze to the floor, her jaw set tight. Arthur's expression did not change. He simply stared straight ahead at a water stain on the wall, breathing slowly and deliberately. Julian let out a sharp, triumphant laugh. "Well, everything seems perfectly clear, little brother," Julian muttered under his breath, leaning back in his chair. Arthur remained silent. "Mr. Vance, are you entirely certain this is what my father signed?" Martha asked, her voice dangerously calm while her hands twisted the strap of her purse. Vance refused to meet her eyes, focusing instead on his papers. "It is duly signed, witnessed, and notarized, Mrs. Miller. The will of the deceased is absolute." Julian grinned broadly, leaning across the desk. "You heard the man, Martha. The ranch has a new owner. And you, Arthur, you've got an old dog who can barely walk. Consider it a sentimental keepsake from Dad and move along." Arthur stood up slowly, picking up his worn felt hat from the chair. He looked at the lawyer with eyes that held neither anger nor pleading, merely an infinite weariness. "Thank you, counselor. Good afternoon." He turned and walked out. Leo followed close behind him, while Martha paused at the doorway, turning her head to look back at Julian with a terrifying, heavy stillness. "I hope fortune treats you well, Julian," she whispered before stepping out into the cold afternoon air. Julian watched them leave, then drummed his fingers arrogantly on the mahogany desk, confident that his victory was absolute. Julian wasted no time asserting his new authority. That very afternoon, he drove his pickup truck down the gravel lane to the small cottage where Arthur and his family had lived for over a decade within the ranch boundaries. Julian brought along 2 burly ranch hands he had hired out of town that morning, men who knew nothing of the local history and cared even less. Arthur was out by the cattle corral, repairing a broken wooden fence rail when he saw them approach. "Arthur, I need this space for a new foreman," Julian announced loudly, leaning against the truck door. "You and your family have until sundown to pack up your things and get off the property." Martha stepped out from the kitchen porch, her hands stained with flour. "Julian, for the love of God, where do you expect us to go with a teenage boy on short notice?" Julian shrugged indifferently. "That's not my problem, Martha. This ranch is mine now, and every square inch belongs to me." He looked directly at his brother. "You know how it is, Arthur. Don't make me do this the hard way." Leo rushed out from behind the shed, carrying a heavy iron shovel. His young face flushed bright red with helpless rage. Arthur reached out without turning his head, planting a firm, heavy hand on his son's chest. "Drop that, Leo." "Dad, let me go." "I said drop it." Julian smirked, shaking his head. "That's right, boy. Learn early how the world works. The man with the papers owns the land, and the man who owns the land gives the orders. That's how it's always been, and that's how it always will be." Arthur turned and walked back inside the cottage without offering a single word in defense. He pulled out the battered canvas suitcase from under the bed, throwing in his work shirts, the framed photographs of his late mother, the wooden crucifix left by his grandmother, and his heavy steel-toed work boots. Martha wrapped leftover bread in a checkered tablecloth, while Leo gathered his schoolbooks with rough, angry movements. Before walking out the front door for the last time, Arthur stepped out onto the porch. Faithful was lying there on the cold stone stoop, watching him with those deep, ancient amber eyes. Arthur knelt down and stroked the dog's graying head. "Come on, old friend." The dog rose without a hint of haste, as if he had been anticipating this exact moment for years. The four of them walked down the dusty dirt road as the sun began its long descent toward the western horizon. Julian watched them go from the ranch gate with his arms crossed over his chest, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. Faithful walked steadily by Arthur's side, his shoulder brushing against the man's leg with every step. When they finally reached the boundary line where the ranch disappeared behind a ridge of cottonwood trees, Leo broke the silence. "Dad, that wasn't right. You worked this land your whole life, since you were my age." "I know, son." "Then how can it possibly be legal?" "I don't know if it's legal, Leo, but I know that fighting Julian on his terms, with his lawyers and his rules, isn't going to get us anywhere. We have to think ahead." "And where are we going?" Martha asked softly. Arthur did not answer immediately, keeping his eyes fixed on the winding path ahead. "Old Man Proctor lives across the dry creek bed," Martha suggested after a moment. "He always told us that if we ever needed a roof over our heads, his door was open." Arthur nodded slowly. "Let's go see Mr. Proctor." Don Proctor, or Mr. Proctor, as everyone called him, was 78 years old and lived entirely alone in a weather-beaten adobe cabin situated just across the dry arroyo, about a 20-minute walk from the edge of the Willow Creek property. Proctor had worked alongside Benjamin Miller since they were young men, long before Arthur was even born. He belonged to that vanishing breed of men who asked for nothing and offered only what they could faithfully deliver. When he saw the small family approaching down the rocky trail with their suitcases, bundles of food, and the old black dog, he did not waste breath on foolish questions. He simply stood up from the wooden bench outside his door, walked over to a small shed in the back used for storing spare tools, and emptied it out within 30 minutes. "There's enough room for the three of you in here," Proctor said gruffly, gesturing to the clean space. "There's a spare iron cot and a woven rug for the floor. The water well is right outside. It's not much, but it has a sturdy roof and 4 solid walls." "Mr. Proctor, we don't even know how to begin to thank you," Martha said, her voice catching slightly. "You already have. Your father-in-law did me a solid turn 40 years ago," Proctor replied, his sharp eyes softening as he looked at Arthur. "It's good to have folks around here again. Go on inside and get settled." That evening, they ate in relative silence by the light of a single kerosene lamp. Leo fell asleep early on the narrow cot, exhausted by the emotional upheaval of the day. Martha knelt down quietly in the corner, offering a silent prayer before hanging a small silver medal of the Virgin Mary on a nail driven into the adobe wall. Arthur sat outside on the rough wooden threshold in the pitch-black night. Faithful lay across his boots, keeping him warm against the rising autumn chill. "What did you know, old boy?" Arthur whispered down into the darkness. Faithful lifted his heavy head, let out a soft huff of air, and rested it back down. "My dad loved you more than most people, and I always thought that was strange. You aren't just a regular ranch dog, you're something else entirely." The dog did not bark, but he thumped his tail twice against the dirt, acknowledging the truth in the man's words. The next afternoon, Leo was the first to notice the strange behavior. It was shortly after 5 o'clock, and the evening shadows were stretching long across the sagebrush, when Faithful suddenly stood up, stretched his hind legs, sniffed the evening air with intense concentration, and began trotting purposefully down the dirt trail without looking back. Leo followed him out of sheer youthful curiosity. The dog crossed the dry creek bed using the flat stepping stones, climbed a small ridge choked with thick thorn bushes, and marched directly toward the northern perimeter fence of the Willow Creek Ranch, the exact boundary line separating Mr. Proctor's land from the property Julian now owned. About 3 yards inside the fence line, standing tall and imposing, was an ancient gnarled cedar tree with a trunk twisted sharply toward the east, and massive roots exposed above the soil, like skeletal hands clawing at the earth. Faithful trotted straight to the base of that cedar tree, sat down firmly on his haunches, and stared intently at the patch of earth nestled between the protruding roots. He did not bark. He did not paw at the ground. He simply locked his amber gaze onto that exact spot, as if guarding a secret visible only to him. Leo crept up close enough to observe without crossing the barbed wire fence. The dog glanced back at the boy once, returned his fixed stare to the dirt, and remained completely motionless. When Leo hurried back to the adobe cabin, he was breathing heavily. "Dad, you've got to come see the dog." He walked straight across the creek, went right up to the old cedar tree near the north fence, and just sat down staring at the ground. "He hasn't moved for 20 minutes. Arthur dropped his pocket knife and stood up abruptly. "To the boundary cedar?" "Yes, right at the foot of the tree, like he's waiting for something." Arthur furrowed his brow, a deep suspicion forming in his mind. This was not normal canine behavior. This was the focused, deliberate stance of an animal trained for a specific purpose. The following day, at the exact same hour, Faithful repeated the ritual, marching straight to the cedar tree and staying there until dusk fell before returning alone. On the third day, Arthur decided to follow him. He trailed a few yards behind the dog as Faithful trotted purposefully across the arroyo and sat down beneath the gnarled branches. The dog looked down at the earth, then turned his head to look back at Arthur, repeating the gesture twice, down to the dirt, then up to the man. "What's down there, Faithful?" Arthur muttered, stepping across the boundary wire onto the ranch land. He knelt beside the animal, running his calloused hands over the dog's thick black coat, behind his ears, and down along his heavy leather collar. That was when his fingers caught on something unusual. Near the rusted brass buckle, a section of the old, weather-darkened leather felt remarkably thick and rigid, as if something had been carefully stitched into an internal pocket. Using the small bone-handled pocket knife from his trousers, Arthur worked carefully, slicing through the heavy waxed threads with painstaking precision. The leather flap parted like an envelope. Inside lay a tiny, sealed tin cylinder about the size of a man's pinky finger. capped with a dollop of hardened beeswax. With trembling fingers, Arthur pulled it free, scraped away the wax, and tipped the cylinder. Two items slid out into his palm: a tiny, rusted skeleton key and a remarkably thin, tightly rolled slip of onion skin paper. Uncurling the delicate paper, Arthur instantly recognized the handwriting. It was his father's distinctive script, tight, hurried, and sharply slanted to the right. The old cedar by the northern boundary, 4 paces north of the trunk, 2 feet deep. The key opens the box. For you alone, Arthur. Protect what you find and understand before you act. There is a debt that must be paid, and I lacked the courage to pay it in life. Forgive me, son. Your father. Arthur read the brief note 3 times in the fading light while a hawk circled high overhead. Faithful stood up, brushed his muzzle gently against Arthur's hand once, and sat back down. "Thank you, old friend," Arthur whispered, pocketing the key and the note, as the cold wind swept down from the hills. That night, Julian rode his horse across the creek to Mr. Proctor's property, appearing uninvited and visibly intoxicated, his felt hat pushed back on his sweaty forehead. He shouted from outside the cabin without bothering to dismount. "Arthur, get out here. We need to talk." Arthur stepped out into the doorway, holding a kerosene lantern, casting long, wavering shadows across the dirt yard. Mr. Proctor peered cautiously through the small glass window of the cabin. Leo tried to follow his father outside, but Arthur stopped him with a sharp hand gesture. "Stay inside with your mother." Julian swung down from his saddle with considerably less grace than he intended, stumbling slightly on his boot heels. "I want the dog, Arthur," Julian demanded, leaning against the horse's flank to steady himself. Arthur looked at him in total silence. "What could you possibly want with Faithful?" "He's a ranch dog, which means he belongs to me under the estate," Julian slurred, waving a hand dismissively. "The will was a technical oversight. You got stuck with him by mistake." "The will that you arranged, Julian? What are you talking about?" Julian's face hardened, the alcohol in his blood doing little to dull his underlying malice. "I'll trade you 2 prime dairy heifers for him. Good milkers. They'll serve you a lot better than that old nuisance who can barely walk." "The dog isn't for sale, Julian. My father left him to me. It's the only thing he left me, and he's mine." Julian's voice dropped an octave, turning flat, cold, and dangerously quiet. "There are things in this world that are much easier when people simply accept their place, brother. It wouldn't be wise of you to push me on this. I know how things work around here, and you know how I operate. I can make life very difficult for you indeed." Arthur stepped forward, holding the lantern steady. "You threw me out of the home I was born in with 4 hours' notice, Julian. What more could you possibly take from me?" Julian stared at him for a long, venomous moment before hoisting himself back into the saddle without another word. As he wheeled his horse around to leave, he shot one final threat over his shoulder. "I'll be back tomorrow morning. You'd better have made up your mind by then." The horse's hoofbeats faded into the darkness. Inside the cabin, Faithful let out a single, very low rumble in his throat. Mr. Proctor stepped out onto the porch with his arms crossed, watching the empty trail. "That man is afraid of something," the old-timer remarked quietly. "And when Julian is afraid, he becomes dangerous." Arthur nodded, already turning his thoughts toward the morning. Before the first pale streaks of dawn painted the eastern sky, Arthur, Leo, and Faithful set out across the dry arroyo, equipped with a heavy shovel and a steel flashlight. They reached the base of the gnarled cedar tree just as the morning mist was beginning to lift off the grass. Measuring 4 paces north from the center of the trunk using his heavy work boot, Arthur sank the blade of the shovel into the earth. The topsoil was hard and packed, but around 2 feet down, the consistency changed dramatically. Loose, disturbed earth, indicating that someone had dug a deep hole here decades ago and filled it back in. At roughly 4 feet, the shovel struck something solid with a dull, echoing metallic thud. That's it, Dad," Leo whispered excitedly. They dropped to their knees, clearing away the remaining dirt with their bare hands to avoid damaging whatever lay buried below. It was Leo who touched the container first. An old metal strongbox, darkened and pitted by decades of dampness and rust, roughly the size of a shoebox, and secured with heavy iron wire. They hauled it up carefully. It was surprisingly heavy. Arthur wiped the surface clean with his sleeve, inserted the tiny, rusted skeleton key into the padlock, and turned it. The mechanism gave a sharp, metallic screech of protest before the rusted latch popped open. Inside, wrapped tightly in a heavy layer of waterproof canvas cloth, was a thick stack of yellowed papers tied together with heavy twine, alongside a small leather pouch pulled shut with a leather cord. Leo picked up the pouch, hefting it in his palm. It felt dense, as though filled with small, heavy stones. "What's in here, Dad?" Arthur carefully untied the cord and tipped the pouch into his hand. Heavy antique gold coins spilled out, catching the dim morning light. Large U.S. double eagle coins bearing the stamp of a soaring eagle on the reverse side, and dates so worn they were barely legible. There were 14 coins in total, gleaming with a rich, heavy yellow luster that needed no sunlight to prove its worth. "My God," Leo breathed, staring down at his father's open palm. Arthur said nothing. He slid the coins back into the pouch, picked up the thick packet of documents, wrapped everything securely back in the canvas, and placed the metal box back into the hole, covering it carefully with earth so that no obvious signs of disturbance remained. Faithful sat quietly, 2 paces away, watching every move with steady vigilance. "Let's get back to the cabin," Arthur instructed. That evening, once Martha and Leo had fallen fast asleep, Arthur sat alone at the rough-hewn wooden table by the light of the flickering kerosene lamp, with the old black dog resting his chin across his boots. He unfolded the letters written by his father. Benjamin Miller's handwriting began with bold, firm strokes at the top of the page, but gradually grew smaller, shakier, and more erratic toward the bottom, as if the physical strength to hold the pen had been draining away with every agonizing sentence. "Arthur, my son, if you are reading this, it means Faithful successfully performed the task I trained him to do, and that you had the patience to listen to what he was trying to tell you. That alone proves you are the same man I raised. What I am about to tell you has weighed on my conscience for 40 years. It is the ugliest thing I ever did in my life, and I did it with my eyes wide open, which is what hurts the most, knowing full well what I was doing. When I was 32 years old, I bought the land where the Willow Creek Ranch now stands alongside a man named Solomon Fuentes. Solomon was the truest friend I ever had. We grew up together, went to the same school, and worked side by side as young men. When we finally gathered enough capital to purchase this ranch, each of us contributed exactly half the money. The original deed bore both our names. Solomon was the one with a head for numbers, business, and legal paperwork. I knew the land, the cattle, and the hard labor. We complemented each other perfectly. We were going to build a life together as equal partners. But your brother Julian was 12 years old at the time, and he already possessed a cruel ambition inside him, a poison I never understood, for it certainly didn't come from me. Julian came to my father, your grandfather Raphael, who was living with us then, and lied straight to his face. Julian claimed he had overheard Solomon talking in town with a city land speculator, cutting a secret deal to sell off his half of the ranch behind my back. My father, Raphael, confronted me in a blind fury. Being hot-headed and proud, and foolishly believing that my own blood couldn't lie to me, I marched straight out to confront Solomon without even stopping to listen to his side. Words led to a violent argument, one of those sudden, brutal bouts of frontier anger where men use their fists instead of their heads. Solomon stumbled backward, his head striking the sharp stone corner of the concrete cattle-watering trough. He didn't die immediately. He lingered in agony for 3 days in the back room of the house. I panicked so completely that I refused to call a doctor in time. By the time I finally brought help, it was too late. Solomon died without ever understanding why his lifelong friend had attacked him, and I remained behind to pick up the pieces. Using forged papers and a corrupt young law clerk named Harrison Vance, who was fresh out of school back then and eager for easy money, I managed to wipe Solomon's name off the deed entirely, taking full ownership of the ranch. Solomon's wife, Remedios, fled the county with their 6-year-old son, Hilario, and I never saw them again. I heard years later that Remedios died of pneumonia, and the boy was raised by an aunt in another state. I lived with that ghost breathing down my neck for 40 years, Arthur. 40 years of broken sleep, of seeing Solomon's eyes right as he closed them forever, and praying for God to let me find a way to make it right. And God, who is just, even if his clock runs slow, finally gave me the answer, piece by piece. Years later, when Julian was grown, I confronted him about that old story. I asked him outright if it was true that he had seen Solomon trying to sell his share. Julian looked me in the eye and didn't even blink. He smiled, that small, cold, effortless smirk of someone who had successfully manipulated the board. Solomon Fuentes never planned to sell his half. Your brother invented that entire malicious lie out of thin air just so he could secure the entire ranch for himself one day. He was only 12 years old when he hatched that plot, and I became the unwitting instrument of his wickedness without ever realizing it. The gold coins you found belonged to the Fuentes family. We pooled them together when we bought the land, and I kept them all these years intending to return them to his kin. I never found Hilario. Truth be told, I never looked hard enough because I was too cowardly to face what I had done. The documents in the box are the original deeds bearing both names. They are the only legal proof that half this ranch legally belonged to Solomon Fuentes. Arthur, my son, you are the only one who can undo the wrong I committed. I am not asking you to destroy your brother. I am asking you to return what was stolen, to find whoever remains of the Fuentes family, and give them back their inheritance. Only then can I truly rest. Don Proctor knows part of this story. He witnessed what happened that afternoon. Ask him, and he will fill in the remaining blanks. Forgive me, son, your father, who loved you far more than he ever knew how to say. Benjamin Miller. Arthur folded the yellowed pages with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Outside in the dark, a lone cricket chirped against the chill. Faithful rested his heavy chin back on Arthur's boots, and the two of them sat in unbroken silence as the crushing weight of a 40-year secret settled heavily over the small room. Finally, Arthur bowed his head and whispered a short, desperate plea into the empty air. Help me make this right. Early the next morning, Arthur walked across the creek to find Mr. Proctor. The old man was in his vegetable patch, tending to the last of the hardy winter kale, when Arthur approached with the letter in his hand. Proctor straightened up slowly, setting down his garden hoe, and looked at Arthur with the infinite patience of a man who had already lived past his time. You found what your father hid, didn't you? I did, Mr. Proctor. He told me you witnessed what happened between him and Solomon Fuentes. Proctor sighed, a long, rattling breath of deep exhaustion. Sit down, Arthur. What I have to tell you is a heavy story. He gestured toward the wooden bench, sitting down opposite Arthur and resting his weathered hands on his knees. I was 22 years old when I started working this land. I saw your father and Solomon arrive together, hammering the first fence posts, cutting the first irrigation furrows. They were different men, but they fit together like clockwork. Solomon was cheerful, talkative, always quick to laugh. Your father was quiet, serious, a man of few words, but they cared for each other. Proctor paused, staring off into the middle distance. The day it happened, I was repairing a broken beam on the old horse barn across the yard. I heard shouting. Your father came storming out of the house, furious. I'd never seen him look like that. Solomon didn't even understand what was happening. You could see the utter confusion on his face. Your father accused him of trying to sell the land behind his back to a city speculator. Solomon denied it vehemently, raising his hands, swearing it was a lie, asking who had poisoned your father's mind with such filth. But your father wouldn't listen. He flew at him. Proctor closed his eyes briefly. Solomon tripped backward over the rough stone foundation of the cattle trough. The corner of that stone was sharp as a blade. It was a terrible, fatal blow. I saw the whole thing from the barn, Arthur. But I didn't come out. I was a terrified young farmhand, and I was afraid of your father. I kept my mouth shut. And that cowardice is the heaviest thing I've carried in my chest for 40 years. And Julian? Arthur asked through clenched teeth. Where was he? Julian was standing right there by the corner of the house, watching the whole thing unfold, Proctor said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He didn't lift a finger to help Solomon. And when your father finally looked up and caught his eye, Julian nodded at him. A slow, approving little nod that told his father the violence was justified. It froze the blood in my veins then, and it freezes it now. And you never told anyone? Never. And may God forgive me for it. Proctor looked up earnestly. Your father told me before he died that he finally realized Julian had lied to him all along. He told me he felt like a fool. But more than that, he felt like a monster for letting his own ambition and pride blind him. 2 days later, a young woman stepped down from the afternoon stagecoach that rolled into Cedar County from the state capital. Valentina Fuentes was 26 years old, with dark hair woven into a thick braid, wearing simple clothes, and carrying a canvas backpack stuffed with legal documents she had spent 3 years tracking down. She walked straight to the small, overgrown town cemetery. Following a hand-drawn map given to her by an elderly woman in the county seat who still remembered the tragedy of the Fuentes family. She walked quietly among the weather-beaten gravestones until she found the modest concrete marker she was searching for. Solomon Fuentes, 1952-1989. May he rest in peace. Valentina knelt down, placing a small bunch of yellow marigolds she had bought at the station against the faded stone. She closed her eyes, her lips moving in silent prayer. Grandpa, I made it. I know it took me too long, but my father told me everything before he passed away, and I promised him I wouldn't let your name stay buried in the dirt. I'm here now, and I'm not leaving until the truth is told. What Valentina did not realize was that from across the narrow paved road, Attorney Harrison Vance was sitting inside his parked truck, watching her through the windshield. He had stopped by the cemetery to drop flowers at his own mother's grave, but the moment he laid eyes on the young woman standing before Solomon Fuentes' headstone, the blood drained entirely from his face. He fumbled his truck into gear, spun the steering wheel wildly, and sped straight toward the Willow Creek Ranch. Julian was sitting in his Grand Ranch office reviewing financial statements when Vance burst through the door without knocking. "Julian, you need to listen to me. You look like you've seen a ghost, Harrison. What is it?" "There's a young woman in town. She was just at the cemetery standing by Solomon Fuentes' grave." Julian froze, the pen hovering over his ledger. "What does she look like?" "Young, dark hair in a braid, carrying a backpack full of old papers. She's looking for answers, Julian. And if she has what I think she has—" "Relax, Harrison," Julian snapped, though his own hands were suddenly trembling. "Solomon died 40 years ago. What kind of proof could she possibly have?" "You don't understand. Solomon was meticulous. He kept copies of everything. If his family managed to hold on to those records—" "Then we deal with it," Julian cut in coldly. "You helped me alter those original documents 40 years ago, Vance. You're as deep in this as I am." Vance glared at him with undisguised panic. "I helped you with your father's recent will, Julian, and that was already stretching my ethics to the breaking point. If this business with the Fuentes family blows wide open, I'm cutting myself loose. You're on your own." Vance turned and walked out of the office, slamming the heavy oak door behind him. That very afternoon, a certified envelope arrived in Julian's mailbox. It was a final notice from the Regional Agricultural Bank. A massive $3 million operating loan that his father had taken out 9 years prior had finally matured, and, with accumulated interest and unpaid penalties, the bank was threatening immediate foreclosure unless the balance was settled in full within 90 days. $3 million. Julian crumpled the letter in his fist, hurled it across the room, and poured himself a heavy glass of whiskey, tossing it back in a single burning swallow. His wife, Hortensia, walked into the office moments later, holding an uninvited cup of coffee. "What is going on, Julian? You've been locked in here shouting for half an hour." "Nothing that concerns you, Hortensia." "Don't tell me it doesn't concern me. I've watched you run this place into the ground for months." She spotted the crumpled bank notice on the floor, picked it up before Julian could snatch it away, and scanned the bold print. $3 million. She looked up at her husband in horror. "Julian, where on earth are we going to get $3 million? I'll handle it." "How? By selling off the cattle? If you sell the cattle, the ranch stops producing income, and within a year we won't have a roof over our heads." Hortensia slammed the coffee cup down on the desk. "You brought me here promising wealth and status. You swore your father's estate would set us up for life, and now it turns out the whole damn empire is drowning in debt." "Shut your mouth, Hortensia." "I will not shut up. I've spent years covering for your lies, and I am done." Julian stepped forward, his face dark with rage. "I told you to drop it. And I'm telling you to start telling me the truth, because something tells me this loan isn't the only skeleton you've got buried in this house." Julian turned his back on her, stormed out of the office, and slammed the door so hard a framed photograph on the wall crashed to the floor. Hortensia stood alone in the suffocating silence, holding the bank notice and realizing with chilling certainty that the foundation of their entire life was built on quicksand. It was Mr. Proctor who finally brought Arthur and Valentina together. Valentina had spent 2 days in town renting a small room above the local feed store, visiting the local parish priest, Father Thomas, and piecing together the fragments of local history. When Proctor heard about the young woman asking questions about the Millers and the Fuentes families, he saddled his horse, rode straight to town, and brought her back across the creek. That afternoon, Valentina and Arthur sat across from one another at the wooden table inside Mr. Proctor's cabin. Spread out between them was an incredible collection of evidence. Valentina's certified copies of land titles, letters written by Solomon Fuentes from his hospital bed before he passed away, bank receipts, and notary records. Alongside them lay the original deeds and Benjamin Miller's signed confession that Arthur had retrieved from beneath the cedar tree. "My grandfather put up half the capital for this land," Valentina said softly, her voice remarkably steady despite the deep sorrow in her eyes. "I know," Arthur replied, pointing to the bank ledger. "Here is the official deposit showing both of their names on the original purchase agreement from 40 years ago." "And your father?" "My father was blinded by a malicious lie," Arthur said, his jaw tightening. "A lie told by a 12-year-old boy who wanted it all for himself. My brother, Julian." Valentina looked across the table, her dark eyes softening with an unexpected empathy. "You didn't know anything about this, did you, Mr. Miller?" "No, but I am the son of the man who committed the crime, and I've lived off land that rightfully belonged to your family. That makes this my responsibility, too." Valentina studied him for a long moment. "Are you with me on this, Arthur?" "I am with you all the way, Miss Fuentes. Whatever it takes." In the corner, Mr. Proctor nodded slowly, offering a quiet, solemn sign of approval. It did not take long for Julian to learn that his brother and the strange young woman had joined forces. Secrets in a small farming community vanished like morning dew under the desert sun. Desperate and increasingly unhinged, Julian turned to the only kind of help he understood. He drove out to a desolate stretch of scrubland in the foothills to meet a man named Tully Garza, a ruthless, hard-bitten local fixer known as the Razor for his thin frame and absolute lack of moral compass. "I need you to keep a very close eye on my brother and that woman," Julian told him, tossing a thick roll of bills onto the dashboard of Garza's battered truck. "And I need you to be ready when I give the word." "What kind of word, Mr. Miller?" Garza asked, his eyes glinting greedily. "There's a dog involved, and there are documents. I need both taken care of permanently." "The dog can be handled. What about the papers?" "Just get them, Tully. Whatever it takes." Garza pocketed the cash without blinking an eye. "Consider it done." Young Leo was the first to realize they were being watched. While walking near the perimeter of Proctor's land, he noticed a lone horseman trailing them from a distance, ducking behind the mesquite bushes whenever Leo looked back. Knowing the terrain far better than any hired stranger, Leo looped around through a dry wash, doubled back, and managed to overhear Garza talking on a two-way radio near the ranch fence line. "Yeah, boss. I got eyes on the kid. Should I snatch him to keep the father in line?" Panic surging through his veins, Leo turned to run back toward the cabin, but his boot caught on a protruding tree root, sending him crashing hard into the dirt. Before he could scramble back to his feet, Tully Garza stepped out from behind the brush, grabbing the boy roughly by the arm. "Not so fast, kid. You're coming with me for a little walk." When Leo failed to return by evening, Martha panicked. She ran across to the cabin where Arthur was reviewing the documents by lamplight. "Leo isn't back. He went out to check on the sheep hours ago, and he hasn't come home." Arthur stood up instantly, his blood running cold. At dawn the next morning, a local boy delivered a crumpled note to the porch of Proctor's cabin. "We have the boy. He's safe, for now. If you want to see him again, bring the metal box, the original deeds, and the dog to the old stone ford at Blue River by noon today. Come alone. If you bring the law, you'll be burying your son instead. Do not test me." Arthur stared at the paper, his hands trembling with a cold, blinding rage. He looked at Martha, who was weeping quietly in the corner, and at Mr. Proctor, who was already reaching over the mantelpiece to grab his old double-barreled shotgun. "No, Mr. Proctor," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm register. "We play this my way. Martha, take the truck and drive to the county seat. Find Judge Peralta. Tell him everything. Tell him to bring federal marshals. I need to buy us some time." Martha grabbed her jacket, kissed Arthur fiercely on the cheek, and ran out the door without looking back. The old stone ford at Blue River was a desolate, wind-swept crossing where the river widened over a bed of gray limestone slabs, flanked by thick walls of river reeds and sparse cottonwood trees. It was high noon when Arthur arrived on foot, carrying a heavy burlap sack slung over his shoulder and a strong box in his hand. 2 minutes later, Julian rode into view from the opposite bank, accompanied by Tully Garza and another hired hand. Tied securely to a lead rope held by Garza was Leo, his forehead bruised and his hands bound tightly behind his back. "Let the boy go, Julian," Arthur shouted across the shallow water. Julian dismounted leisurely, a smug, cruel smile playing across his lips. "First things first, little brother. Show me what's in the box." Arthur placed the metal box on a flat limestone boulder, popped the latch, and flipped it open. The midday sun struck the top layer of gold coins, making them flash brilliantly against the gray stone. Julian's eyes widened with greed. "And the papers? The original deeds?" "You'll get them when Leo is standing right beside me," Arthur replied, his voice hard as iron. Julian gestured impatiently to Garza. "Push the kid forward." Garza shoved Leo hard toward the water's edge. The boy stumbled, regained his balance, and began running across the shallow ford toward his father. At that exact moment, Arthur dropped the burlap sack. Out leaped Faithful, barking with surprising fury, lunging directly at Tully Garza's legs. Startled by the sudden attack, Garza lost his footing, his finger convulsing on the trigger of his rifle. The gun blasted into the air, the bullet screaming wide, missing Leo entirely, but striking Arthur squarely in the right shoulder as he threw himself between his son and the line of fire. Arthur crumpled to the wet stones with a muffled groan, blood instantly soaking through his flannel shirt. "Dad!" Leo screamed, throwing himself down beside his father. Before Julian could react, a deafening roar echoed across the riverbanks. From behind the dense thicket of cottonwoods upstream, 4 dark green federal vehicles burst into the clearing, doors flying open as heavily armed federal marshals poured out, their rifles raised and locked. "Federal marshals! Drop your weapons! Nobody move!" Tully Garza dropped his rifle instantly, throwing his hands into the air. Julian froze, turning pale as chalk, staring in sheer horror as the iron handcuffs were slammed onto his wrists. He looked down at Arthur, who was struggling to sit up while Leo pressed his hands against the bleeding wound. For the first time in his life, Julian's arrogant facade completely shattered, replaced by the hollow, sickening realization that his empire of lies had finally collapsed. The trial of Julian Miller and his co-conspirators took place 3 winter weeks later in the newly appointed municipal courtroom, which was packed to absolute capacity with local residents, regional reporters, and old ranch hands who had traveled from miles around. Judge Howard Peralta presided over the bench with an expression of stern, unyielding gravity. The evidence presented against the defendants was overwhelming. Mr. Proctor testified about the fatal altercation he had witnessed 40 years prior between Benjamin Miller and Solomon Fuentes. 2 elderly former ranch hands who had served under Benjamin took the stand to confirm the forged land registers. Valentina Fuentes presented the unbroken chain of custody for her grandfather's property titles. But the most devastating testimony came from an unexpected source, Hortensia, Julian's estranged wife walked into the courtroom under her own volition, carrying a cardboard box filled with the paper trail of financial fraud, secret payoffs to Harrison Vance, and mortgage documents detailing years of systemic embezzlement. When Julian took the stand in his own defense, he offered no excuses, no clever rebuttals, and no arrogant smiles. He simply sat in the defendant's chair with his head bowed low, staring at the scarred wooden surface of the table. Judge Peralta delivered the verdict with crisp, solemn precision. Julian Miller was found guilty of aggravated fraud, forgery of public documents, conspiracy, kidnapping, and complicity in attempted murder, sentencing him to 24 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Harrison Vance received 16 years for his role in judicial forgery and cover-ups, while Tully Garza was sentenced to 30 years for armed kidnapping and assault. As the bailiffs led Julian away in clinking irons, he paused for a brief second, casting one final, lingering look at Arthur, who sat in the front row with his shoulder still bandaged, flanked by Martha, Leo, and Valentina. There was no triumph in Arthur's eyes, only a profound, exhausted sorrow. By early spring, the Willow Creek Ranch, now officially renamed the Fuentes Miller Estate, was breathing with new life. Valentina assumed full ownership of the historic property, bringing in experienced agricultural managers from the state capital to restructure operations, pay off the crushing debts Julian had accumulated, and restore the land to its former glory. The old ranch hands, who had been unjustly fired years ago, were rehired with full back pay and newfound respect. Arthur and his family chose to remain in the expanded cottage near the creek, declining Valentina's offer to move into the grand farmhouse, though Arthur agreed to serve as the estate's primary director of operations, working side by side with Valentina as true equal partners, just as their fathers had originally intended 4 decades ago before greed and deceit tore their lives apart. On a clear, crisp afternoon in late April, Arthur walked alone up the gentle slope toward the northern boundary fence, stopping beneath the gnarled branches of the old cedar tree. Faithful trotted quietly at his heels, his gray muzzle catching the golden sunlight. Arthur reached down, resting his hand gently on the dog's head, and whispered softly into the breeze, "We finished what you started, old boy. Everyone is finally home." The old black dog let out a contented sigh, lowered his head onto his paws, and closed his amber eyes, resting easy at last in a world where the truth, no matter how long it sleeps beneath the dirt, always finds a way back to the light.